Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Brother Joseph podcast, the official podcast of the new mega musical Brother Joseph, the amazing true life story of Joseph and Emma Smith. I'm Truce Henbach.
And I'm Brett Battaglia. Thanks for joining us as we explore the remarkable early history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the people, places, and pivotal events that ushered in the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Have you ever been digging into some history and you come across something that just makes you stop and think, what's that about?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like those little historical quirks that just grab your attention.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing today. We're diving into one of those intriguing, and let's be honest, maybe even a little bit eyebrow-raising, aspects of early American religious history.
Oh, I'm interested. Lay it on me.
We're talking about the Seer stones of Joseph Smith.
Seer stones. Okay, now you've really got my attention.
Yeah. The goal is to unpack just how these objects ended up playing a pretty extraordinary role in the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm in. Sounds fascinating.
And to guide us on this deep dive, we're going to be drawing from an incredible resource. It's Michael Hubbard McKay and Nicholas J. Frederick's book, Joseph Smith's Seer Stones.
A deep dive in itself, for sure.
It really is. So our mission here is to distill those key insights from McKay and Frederick and really explore the whole picture. We're talking the historical backdrop, the theological implications, and how all of this connects to 19th century American culture.
Sounds like we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do, but it's going to be an enlightening journey, I promise. To really grasp the significance of these seer stones, we first have to transport ourselves back to the world in which Joseph Smith lived.
Back to the 19th century.
Exactly. Early 19th century America, especially in Western New York, was this incredibly religiously charged environment.
Oh yeah, I've heard about this. Wasn't it called the Burned Over District or something like that?
That's the one. It got that name because of the sheer intensity and frequency of religious revivals sweeping through the region. So you can imagine it was a place buzzing with spiritual fervor and experimentation.
So amidst all this intense religious activity, where do these seer stones fit in? Were they part of mainstream Christianity?
Well, that's where things get interesting. While there was certainly a strong presence of established Christian churches, folk religious practices were also deeply woven into the fabric of society at that time.
So it wasn't necessarily an either situation for people. They could participate in these more mystical practices alongside their Christian beliefs.
Precisely. It wasn't uncommon for people to find a way to blend these different approaches to spirituality. And for many, practices like dowsing for water or using special stones to find buried treasure, those were just accepted parts of life.
So we're talking about folk magic. Was that seen as compatible with Christianity by the people at the time? Seems like a bit of a contradiction.
Well, that's one of the most fascinating things that our sources point out. Many people actually found ways to reconcile these practices with their Christian faith. It wasn't necessarily seen as contradictory.
How do they manage that? To square things like magic stones with their Christian beliefs, it seems like a bit of a stretch.
Well, the key was finding precedents within the Bible itself. They looked for scriptural examples that seemed to align with these folk practices, giving them a sense of religious legitimacy.
Biblical precedents. Interesting. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Let's take the Urim and Thummim from the Old Testament. They're mentioned in places like Exodus and Samuel. These were objects associated with the high priest, used for seeking divine guidance.
Okay. And how did those tie in with the seer stones?
Well, while scholars debate the exact nature of the Urim and Thummim, the point is, they were physical objects believed to facilitate communication with the divine. This idea that God could work through tangible things resonated with people and provided a framework for understanding other practices.
Right. So it was like, hey, if it's in the Bible, maybe there's something to this whole seer stone business too.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the Urim and Thummim. There were other biblical instances that seemed to support this connection between the physical and the divine. Take Aaron's rod, for example. From the Book of Numbers, it miraculously budded as a sign of God's favor. Then you have Joseph of Egypt's silver cup. Genesis explicitly states that it was used for divination.
Divination. That sounds pretty mystical.
It does, right. And then you have the precious stones adorning the high priest's breastplate. the enigmatic white stone mentioned in the Book of Revelation. Even things like memorial stones like Ebenezer or the stones taken from the Jordan River. All these examples helped create a cultural understanding that physical objects could have a role in conveying divine messages or power.
Okay, I see how those biblical examples could lend some credence to the idea of using stones for spiritual purposes. So in this environment where religious fervor and folk practices were so intertwined, Joseph Smith's early experiences with seer stones probably wouldn't have seemed that outlandish.
Not at all. It would fit right in with the prevailing cultural beliefs. Now, regarding Joseph Smith's seer stone specifically, he didn't just have one, did he?
No, he didn't. The research suggests he had at least 3, maybe even as many as 5 different stones.
Multiple stones. Interesting. So tell me about the first one. How did he come across it?
Well, the first one that's well documented was discovered around 1822. Joseph, who was in his mid-teens at the time, was helping a neighbor named Willard Chase dig a well. And while they were digging, they unearthed this brown egg-shaped stone.
And that became his primary seer stone, the one most closely associated with him.
That's the one. Now, in the beginning, he wasn't using this stone for anything particularly religious. His early use was firmly rooted in that tradition of treasure-seeking we talked about.
So he would use the stone to try and find buried riches. That was its initial purpose.
Right. He would place the stone in a hat, then put it face in to block out any light, and he claimed that he could see visions. Visions that supposedly led him to hidden treasures.
So he was like a 19th century treasure hunter with his magic hat and his seer stone.
Yeah, kind of. And these activities led to him gaining a local reputation as someone with the ability to see or look using this special stone. He became known as a seer, or a glass looker.
So this skill, it was actually recognized in his community.
Yes. But then, around 1827, things took a dramatic turn with the story of the golden plates. This marked a significant shift in the narrative surrounding Joseph Smith and these seer stones.
Yeah, that's a pivotal moment for sure. How did these stones become connected to this new religious dimension? Because up to this point, it was all about earthly treasure.
Well, with the recovery of the golden plates, the focus shifted from worldly wealth to the acquisition of spiritual knowledge. It was a transition from material to divine revelation. The seer stones then became the instruments through which Joseph Smith claimed to be able to translate these ancient records and receive God's word.
So the seer stone went from a tool for finding buried riches to a means of accessing divine truth.
Exactly, a pretty dramatic transformation, right?
Huge. And I bet a lot of people would be surprised to learn that the translation process wasn't exactly what they might imagine.
It's not the image of Joseph Smith poring over the plates, meticulously deciphering ancient engravings, is it?
Not quite. While later accounts often highlight the Urim and Thummim, those spectacle-like interpreters that were found with the plates, the historical evidence paints a different picture.
A different picture. So how did the translation actually happen?
Well, eyewitness accounts, particularly from his wife Emma and his scribe Martin Harris, strongly suggest that Joseph primarily used his brown seer stone for a large portion of the translation. They describe him dictating the text while looking into the hat, with the golden plates often covered.
Wait, so he was looking into a hat with the seer stone inside and dictating the Book of Mormon?
That's what the historical record, particularly the first-hand accounts, indicate.
That's pretty remarkable. I can see how that might raise some questions.
Oh, absolutely. But let's go back to the theological significance of the seer stones. How were they understood by early members of the church?
Initially, they were viewed as a direct line to God, almost like a divine telephone. The stones, being physical objects, served as a tangible means of communication between the human and the divine. It was a concept that resonated with those folk beliefs of the time, and it certainly had those biblical parallels we discussed earlier.
Right, those biblical precedents helped to legitimize the idea. But the understanding and role of these stones didn't stay fixed, did they?
No, they didn't. That's something McKay and Frederick highlight in their book. They argue that Joseph Smith's abilities as a prophet developed over time. His capacity for receiving revelation evolved. They suggest that these seer stones acted as training wheels for his expanding spiritual gifts.
Training wheels, that's a very interesting way to put it. What do they mean by that?
The idea is that in the beginning, Joseph relied heavily on the brown seer stone, especially for those treasure-seeking endeavors. Then, during the translation of the Book of Mormon, he seems to have used both the brown stone and the interpreters. But as he progressed, his reliance on those physical objects appears to have diminished.
So he needed them less and less as time went on, like he was gradually developing a more direct connection to the divine.
That's the idea. He started receiving more revelation through dreams, visions, and what he described as direct communication with God. It's like those training wheels on a bike. As you gain more balance and skill, you could eventually take them off and ride freely.
That's a great analogy. And that concept of a prophet's abilities developing gradually, it's a pattern we find in the Bible as well, isn't it? Think about Moses, for example. His early interactions with God were mediated through the burning bush, but as he grew in his role, he experienced more direct communication.
Exactly. Those biblical prophets, their relationships with the divine weren't static. They developed, deepened, and matured. And even Joseph Smith himself seemed to acknowledge this progression in his revelations. In Doctrine and Covenants, he talks about the development of the work.
So as his understanding and abilities evolved, even the language used to describe these objects changed.
Oh, absolutely. Initially, he and those around him used terms like interpreters or directors to refer to both the seer stone and the spectacle-like objects. It wasn't until later, somewhere around 1833, that the term Urim and Thummim started being used in connection with these objects. W. W. Phelps seems to be one of the first to publicly make that connection.
And it wasn't just about the term Urim and Thummim, the white stone from Revelation 2.17, that took on a special meaning as well.
Yeah, Joseph Smith interpreted that passage as referring to a personal Urim and Thummim that individuals would eventually receive, something that would allow them to comprehend things of a higher spiritual order. That interpretation is actually recorded in Doctrine and Covenants, section 130.
So these biblical images involving stones, they really permeated early Mormon thought, didn't they?
They really did. Whether it was Christ as the cornerstone, the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem, all of these images from Scripture resonated with early members of the church. It helped them see the use of seer stones as a restoration of ancient practices, a way of reconnecting with the divine as it was done in biblical times.
All right. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the physical characteristics of these stones. What do we actually know about what they looked like?
Well, thanks to historians like McKay and Frederick, we have a decent understanding, particularly of the brown seer stone, the one Joseph used most often. It's described as being oval-shaped, about 5.5 centimeters long, and it had these bands of different shades of brown, kind of like you'd see in a jasper stone.
And the church has even released photographs of this stone in recent years, right?
They have, which is pretty amazing. It allows us to actually see this object that played such a pivotal role in their history. Now, the white stone is a bit more mysterious. We have fewer descriptions of it. Some accounts suggest it was smaller than the brown stone and maybe even somewhat translucent. But its exact appearance and its current whereabouts remain a bit of an enigma.
So one stone has become a sort of historical relic, while the other has been lost to time. It's quite fascinating to consider how these physical objects, with their connections to folk magic and crystal gazing, became so integral to the beginnings of a major world religion. But I imagine there are challenges to fully understanding this history.
Absolutely. We're dealing with primary sources that are often incomplete or potentially biased. The terminology used isn't always consistent, making it tough to piece together a definitive narrative. And of course, as the church grew and sought broader acceptance, there might have been a tendency to emphasize the more traditionally religious aspects of their history and downplay those earlier folk practices.
But it sounds like there's been a shift in recent years towards greater transparency, a willingness to engage with this history more openly. Initiatives like the Joseph Smith Papers Project are a good example of that.
They are. The goal now seems to be to provide a more complete, contextualized understanding of this history, acknowledging those folk magic origins while also highlighting the claims of divine revelation that are central to the faith.
So how do contemporary members of the church reconcile this history, particularly the role of seer stones, with their belief system?
Well, the training wheels concept we discussed earlier has proven quite helpful for many. It allows for an understanding that God worked through the existing cultural context of the time, meeting Joseph Smith where he was, and utilizing those familiar folk practices as a stepping stone towards more direct revelation.
Like a divine pedagogy, adapting to the individual and the context.
Yeah, I like that. And that idea resonates with what we find in Joseph Smith's own revelations, like in Doctrine and Covenants sections 9 and 50, which emphasize that receiving revelation is a process, not an instantaneous event. It takes time, it takes learning, it takes growth. And this idea of God adapting to the individual isn't just a modern interpretation. The historian Richard Bushman, a prominent figure in Mormon studies, has articulated this view very effectively in his work.
So the seer stones, they were a part of that process for Joseph Smith, a means to an end rather than the end itself.
Exactly. And by the time of the Nauvoo period, Joseph was receiving complex, profound revelations without the use of seer stones. That suggests a significant development in his prophetic abilities. Even Elder Dale G. Renlund, a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, has spoken about this gradual development in recent years. It's an important acknowledgement from within the church.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the seer stones of Joseph Smith, what are some of the key takeaways we should keep in mind?
Well, for one, these stones were absolutely central to the early history of Mormonism. They acted as this bridge between the common folk practices of the time and the emergence of new religious revelation. And it's important to remember that their use and interpretation evolved alongside Joseph Smith's own prophetic journey and the institutional development of the church.
And the training wheels analogy, I think that's a helpful way to frame this whole discussion. It highlights that both prophetic calling and receiving divine communication are often processes, not sudden events.
Absolutely. And these stones, even today, they serve as tangible links to that past, prompting us to think about how culture, revelation, and religious movements intertwine and shape one another.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder as you continue to explore these topics. How does understanding the specific historical context of a religious movement, even those aspects that might seem unconventional or even a little strange to modernize, how does that shape your understanding of its later development and its claims to authority? It's something worth considering, isn't it?
Absolutely. It encourages us to approach history with an open mind, to dig deeper, and to recognize the human element that's woven into even the most profound stories of faith and revelation.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. We hope it sparked new insights and deeper appreciation for the unfolding of the restoration. Until next time, then, keep seeking and keep loving.